Ava, am I able to share my screen?
Yeah, I think I enabled it.
Okay, brilliant. Oh yeah, look, there it is. Okay, let's just make this bigger. Everybody can see that? Yeah, rock and roll. Okay. Okay, so we are looking at women in the Bible. And so for this week 2, but this first woman, I've chosen Sarah, which I feel like is fitting because she's kind of at the beginning, this one of like the first women in the Bible. So yeah, let's clear up this. Okay, so we're gonna first go through who is Sarah, Sarai, what is her story. We're gonna look at what we can learn from her, what we can learn about God through her, and then I have some reflection questions and discussion questions at the end that I can't take full credit for because I did find some of these like through research and stuff, so yeah. Okay, so first of all, I split these two up. So here's just a few facts about her. Sarai, I like can't barely pronounce it, but that equals my princess. Like that's the meaning I searched up. And then Sarah also means princess, but when I was doing some research on this, a lot of commentators are saying it means princess to all, which is kind of interesting, that transition, as we'll see, like it kind of shows why God changed her name and what that change represents, which we'll get into. And then also I found out that she's the only woman in the Bible with a name change by God. So she's the only one who God changed her name. But of course we see that with a lot of men in the Bible, not women apparently. Okay, so her story, let's get into that. So it kind of starts, I've included a lot of Abraham in here too because they're partners, that's her husband. So it's really a part of her story as well. So in Genesis 12, the first thing is that they're called to leave their homeland. In verse 1 of Genesis 12, it says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." And then it goes on, "and I will make you a great nation." So that's the first thing. And I feel like that's such a big step of faith they had to take. Like this stepping away from your father, from your family, from your homeland, from everything you know. And I'm sure a lot of us can relate to this too, moving away for university, moving just out of your house. It's a huge step of faith. So then, as we continue in her story, we can go to Genesis 15:5. You can follow along if you want, by the way, with all these verses. Genesis 15:5 says, "And he brought him outside and he said, 'Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them.' Then he said to him, 'So shall your offspring be.'" So this is the big promise that God gave to Abram. He said, you're going to have a nation that's as many as the stars in the skies, if you can even count that many. So again, that's kind of crazy to me because as I was reading that, to think about how much pressure Sarah must have felt in that, knowing that she hasn't had a kid and she's like in her 80s and 90s years old, and God has just promised Abram as many generations as stars in the sky. Like, I can't imagine that. So with that, we get into chapter 16 of Genesis, and Sarai tells Abram to have a child with her servant Hagar, because she says in verse 2 of chapter 16 in Genesis, "And Sarai said to Abram, 'Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children.'" So she was like, God's not going to let it happen. It's not me. Have a child with Hagar, and that's fine. But as we see, and as we continue reading, that's kind of going to backfire on her. And I think I'll get into this more in the next slide about what we can learn from her story. But from that, Hagar had a child with Abram named Ishmael. And Hagar started looking at Sarah with contempt, and she wasn't happy. And that's sort of like that main idea of chapter 16. And then Genesis chapter 17 is 14 years later, Sarah and Abraham, the name change, has a son named Isaac. And so that's the start of those many generations, and Abraham being the father of Israel, basically. Yeah, so that's kind of her story. Is there any questions so far on that, or any details you think I might be missing?
Do you know when her name changed? Like at what point it went from Sarai to Sarah?
Yes, let me check here. Yes, okay, I think I also have this on another slide, but I'll touch on it here as well. Chapter 17, verses 15, it says, "And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah." And so this is like, he changed their name and then promised Isaac. So that's kind of like the sequence of events. Because in my Bible, verse 15 is titled Isaac's birth promised, and that's the verse that starts that section. Thanks for that question. Anything else? Any other questions before I move on? No? Okay, sweet. So now that we know her background, we know her story, what can we learn from her? What can we learn from this story of her telling Abram to have a child with her servant and then actually finally getting a child of her own? So the first thing that I kind of pointed out is pride is real and it is hard. And what I mean by that, to go into detail, is I think Sarah had this pride of like, well, God has prevented me from having this child, so I'm going to do it my way from my own abilities, and I'm going to give Abram my servant and say he can have a child with her, and that's that. But as we see, first of all, our plans when we go above the Lord, it totally backfires because it's not the Lord's plan, it's ours. So of course it's not perfect. Of course there's some human flaws in them. For example, in Genesis 16 verses 5, just to give you an example of how this is backfiring on Sarah, it says, "And Sarah said to him, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." So what Sarah's saying there is that Hagar, now having Abram's son, looked on her with contempt. She was looking down on her, type of thing. And that relationship got damaged. And I don't know this for sure because I don't think I looked into this part enough, but it probably didn't help her relationship with Abram either, having this child with another woman. So that's my first thing, is pride is real and pride is hard, and we can kind of learn from that and just take recognition of our own pride in our own lives and where we kind of stray away from the Lord's plan and the Lord's timing. And then second thing that I think I learned from her and that we can learn from Sarah is that following God is a constant decision. We may not always get it right either. Because if we look back at Genesis 12, when the Lord said, "Go from your country and your father's house," that was such a huge step of faith, and they went. They followed the Lord. Sarah followed her husband in what the Lord said, and they went out to this land that God told them to go to. But then, like 2-3 chapters later, Sarah was like, "No, God's promises aren't happening in my timing. This isn't happening. So I think I have to do this in order to get this." And so in that moment, she didn't make the decision to follow God, it seems. She just kind of took her own route or took her own timing. But then as it continues on, and the angel appears to Abram, and we get into chapter 17, where Isaac's birth is promised, she kind of learns from that past and follows God with true faith, and then has Isaac, like, basically within the year, I believe the chapter says. So it's just that constant thing. Sometimes we're not going to get it right. She followed at first and was like, "Yeah, we'll go to this land." She followed her husband faithfully, but then went back and didn't follow the Lord faithfully, and then back. So it's kind of this back and forth, and it's just a constant decision. Hopefully that makes sense, because I kind of jumbled it a little bit. Okay, so then, as we continue, what do we learn about God through Sarah, and just like through this situation of Abraham and Sarah? So the number one thing I think is that God's grace is incredible and steadfast. Just even as a result of Sarah's actions and everything that happened within this story, God still showed her and Abraham so much grace and still fulfilled his promise, because he knows we're human. He knows we're sinners, and he is so much bigger than all of that. Number two, I found, is that despite our sin, he can still use us for his glory. Chapter 17 of Genesis, verses 16. Let me find this quickly. Oh, yes. And so this is right after the name change. And he says, don't call her Sarah, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her. And moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. So just even as a result of those past actions, nations shall come from her. Kings shall come for her. And it'll be all used for the Lord's glory, which I think is so cool. And then the last thing that I think we learn about God in this is nothing is impossible for the Lord. The verse that I have that correlates with that is Genesis 18, verses 4. No, that is not right. Hold on, let me see if I can find it now. Let's see. Oh, it might be 14. We love typos. Yes, it's okay. It's chapter 18, verses 14, and it says, is anything too hard for the Lord? And so this is right after the angel appeared and told Abram, you're going to have this son. And Sarah laughed to herself. She was like, I'm 90. Are you kidding me? How am I going to have a son? And then he heard her, and she was like, I didn't laugh, but she obviously did. And then the Lord was like, nothing is impossible with me. Like, why are you doubting me? Nothing is too hard for the Lord. So I think that's really awesome. And yeah, I think that's the content for now. So now I'm going to get into some reflection and discussion questions. But before we keep going, is there any other questions, additions to anything I've said so far? Or if you need to see any more slides also. No? Sweet. Okay. So these are kind of more our reflection questions. I have two, and then we'll get into two sort of discussion-y questions, I believe, as well. Again, I can't take too much credit for these because I did have some help from research. So my first question for you that I want to hear about is, how do you react when it comes to waiting and patience? Do you find yourself being like Sarah and almost working with your own timing? Or do you honestly find yourself being a more patient person and being able to be still in the waiting? What do you guys think? Sweet. Okay, so these are more, I think, discussion questions, just like about the content. So we talked about how in chapter 18 and chapter 17, when the Lord was telling Abram, like, you're gonna have this son in like within a year, and Sarah laughed to herself. She was like, yeah, that's funny. Like, I'm 90 years old. Are you kidding me? That's kind of how I see her reacting to this. But my question for you to create this discussion is, why do you think Sarah laughed to herself, and why did she lie to God about it? What do you think there is that there? Well, that concludes everything I had. I loved hearing this discussion. I just like am one to like love to sit and listen and like hear people's thoughts and stuff. So this was awesome. I appreciate all of you sharing. Those legacies were amazing, and I think totally like achievable, because y'all are incredible women and I love it. So yeah, that was it. Thanks for listening, and